She stood on the cracked concrete, hoodie cinched against a wind that smelled of oil and old rain, and said two words that stopped the room. "Can I work here?" It was not a plea. It was not a line rehearsed for pity. It was a small, blunt question, like a hand set down on the counter and waiting to be met. The men inside the clubhouse, most of them large enough to cast long shadows in winter light, fell quiet the way a radio goes dead when a storm passes. Norah's chin lifted just enough to keep her eyes level. A thin crescent of purple showed at the edge of her jaw where a bruise had not yet faded. She kept her fingers tucked into her sleeves. Her sneakers were held together with duct tape. Keller was the first to move. He had the slow, unhurried gait of someone who had learned the value of watching before he acted. He looked at Norah as if he were trying to read the map of a town from the lines in her face. He stepped out onto the threshold and said, plain as a work order, "Show up, don't steal, do the work." It could have been any 3 rules he gave to anyone who turned up asking for a place to put a head down. But the clubhouse was not a shelter, and they were not social workers. They were bikers who fixed bikes and drank coffee at odd hours, who knew how to make a dented gas tank sing again and how to patch a tire with a patch that held. Their world was practical. Their currency was labor and trust. Norah nodded, as if she had been given directions she had been trained to follow. She stepped across the threshold, and the smell hit her. Solvent, metal filings, old leather. The door slammed behind her with the muscular sound of a place that had held itself together through weather and argument and bad music. A broom was handed to her by a man called Lucky, who had grease under his nails and a slow, rough way of smiling that made teeth look like tools. "Start where it starts," he said, and pointed at the line of oil-streaked concrete that made a kind of unspoken border around the workbenches. That first afternoon was something small and steady. Norah learned to sweep so hard the dust came up in a small, obedient cloud. She learned to put nuts in labeled jars and to set bolts in trays by size until her hands remembered which one went next. Lucky gave her a rag and showed her how to fold it into quarters and press rather than scrub, how to keep your hands steady when the wrench slips. Her movements were awkward at the beginning, too tight, like someone waiting for something bad to happen if she relaxed. But work has a way of giving a child a rhythm that conversation cannot. Keller watched more than he spoke. He had a habit of consuming details, how she placed the broom against the bench when she paused, the way she kept glancing toward the door. He didn't probe. He kept rules and expected them to be kept. The clubhouse offered no speeches. It offered a toolbox with a strip of masking tape down the handle. He told her to write her name on it. Norah chose a pencil from Lucky's cup and wrote N-O-R-A with a little loop on the R, as if she were signing her ownership in a ledger that mattered. They did not call it charity. They called it work. On the second day, Tina from the diner turned up with sandwiches wrapped in brown paper and a thermos filled with coffee that smelled almost like home. Tina's apron had grease smudges at the hem and a name sewn on it that had been there longer than the fabric. She set a paper-wrapped sandwich on the table in front of Norah and said, without ceremony, "You look like you could use this," and left a tin of hot soup for the men. It was a small ritual, like the passing of a cup, that put a person into a community by feeding them and by giving them the quiet right to sit at the table. The clubhouse was not soft. It did not pretend to be a halfway house or a haven. It was a ragged place with a jukebox that stuck on certain songs and a bulletin board with wanted posters for lost tools. But it held a different kind of safety, the kind that comes from being seen doing something useful and being allowed to continue doing it until someone trusts you. When Norah finished her shift, Barker, one of the men who kept things moving, tossed her a small wrench and told her to hold on to it. "It's not much," he said, "but it's yours now." That first week set a pattern. She swept in the mornings, learned to change a cable in the afternoon, and spent evenings on the couch at the back with a blanket that had been draped over the arm since someone couldn't remember when. The men, Moose Joe with his broad hands and quicker laugh, Razor, whose tattoos looked like maps of another life, Lie, who kept a keen eye on who came in and when, found small ways to include her. They hung a calendar above the workbench and marked the days she worked in black ink. They put a corkboard on the wall where they pinned a list of chores and eventually homework assignments she'd scrawled in a stiff pencil. The toolbox with her name became a talisman. She wiped it carefully as if it were a relic. There were things she did not talk about, nor did they press. She declined offers of rides to school sometimes, preferring to sit in the back and watch classes go by like a moving train. She kept the same flatness to her voice when asked about home. "It's fine," she'd say. "I have people here." It was a measured truth. She did not need to construct grand narratives for them. She simply showed up. One evening, Lucky found a bruise blooming under the sleeve of her hoodie as he passed a rag across her arm. It was fresh and angry, the kind of purple that sits under the skin and refuses to be bright. He pretended not to look, but his hand was steady when he set down the wrench. He had seen bruises before, on customers who'd come in after fights, on men who'd fallen off their bikes. He also knew patterns. Lucky started a small ledger. He kept it in the back of a tool drawer, scribbling the date in the corner of a torn piece of cardboard and the time she came in or left. He took a photograph, just one, on his old phone, the camera's flash flattening the purple into an object he could pin to a board later. He wrote down where the bruise was and when he saw it. He noted small things, the corners of her mouth when she smiled, the way she labeled her wrench. It was not a grand project. It was a record kept by someone who had found that concrete details matter in a world that often mistook feelings for facts. The men talked about what to do in low voices, not because they wanted to hide anything, but because they wanted to be careful. Keller's instinct was to watch and protect by presence. He kept saying, "We call the people who do the paperwork," like a man who trusted bureaucracy more than his temper. They made one rule among themselves: no taking matters into their own hands. They would call. They would document. They would stand between a child in danger with their bodies if needed, but they would not substitute their judgment for the law. It took time for Molina, the caseworker, to answer the call. She was a woman of neat efficiency who wore her uncertainty like an overcoat, necessary but cumbersome. When she arrived, she did not come with proclamations. She had a laptop bag with a sticker that read CPS and a pair of tired shoes that had walked many neighborhoods. She asked questions about dates and times and wrote them down. She spoke in the measured cadence of someone trained to avoid promises she could not keep. "We don't make immediate judgments at the drop of a hat," she said, "but we act when the evidence warrants it." Evidence was where the clubhouse felt competent. The bikers offered Molina a stack of notes, the ledger with Lucky's entries, a clear photo of a bruised cheek taken on an evening when the overhead light had been harsh enough to make everything look more clinical than the reality. Messages, few and practical, sent to numbers that had not answered. They gave her a list of witnesses who'd seen Norah come and go, who could testify to the regularity of her attendance and the bruises that kept appearing. Keller explained, without bitterness, that they had no legal training, but they knew how to be consistent in documenting things that mattered. Molina listened and then did something that surprised the clubhouse. She asked to speak to Norah alone. There was a hinge in her voice that said she believed in confidential conversations, in letting a child have a space to choose what to say. Norah, who had learned to gauge adults like weather patterns, agreed. She sat on a folding chair and picked at the cuff of her hoodie, while Molina asked about school, about how long she'd been in foster care, about whether anyone had threatened her to stop talking. Norah's answers were clipped, precise, in the way someone used to being measured against authority becomes practiced at giving the bare minimum. When Melina asked if Norah wanted to return to her foster parents' home, the question came with institutional weight. It was not dramatic, it was a simple line of inquiry that had legal consequences. Norah thought for a breath and said, without undue flair, "I don't want to go back. They hurt me there." Her voice was not theatrical, it was clear. That clarity, more than any dramatic speech, was the pivot. Melina's face did not harden into instant heroics. Her job was to take that clarity and fold it into paperwork, into protocols. She explained that she needed to verify what Norah said, and that sometimes the system moved in pieces. First a welfare check, then interviews, then, if necessary, temporary measures that would keep Norah safe. She said things that were practical. "I can file for an emergency welfare check today if the evidence supports it." And, "I need witnesses to corroborate dates and times." She made a list and asked for signatures. The bikers provided the signatures and the list. They signed as people who kept schedules and fixed things and could testify to someone else's attendance at a place. They did not pretend to be professionals. They pretended not to care for appearances if care was what mattered. Moose Joe signed with a heavy hand, his name sprawling like a bench stroke. Barker slid in his name carefully, as if writing on a ledger mattered in the same way a wrench mattered. Lai added a note. She remembered the time Norah had shown up with a shoelace torn in two. Razor signed with a thumbprint smudged into the ink. Clive's name appeared on Norah's paperwork as the foster parent. Keller had seen him once, a man who presented himself like a man who had things under control. He'd come to the clubhouse asking questions, thinly veiled inquiries about where his kid had been, and left when he was given a pile of straight answers and no satisfaction. The first time Clive showed up in person, he parked his truck a little too close to the entrance and walked in with the sort of swagger that tried to take up space. He wore a clean shirt and a watch, the props of a man rehearsed to look respectable. He said to Keller, "She's my responsibility," and there was an edge beneath the phrase that hinted at something brittle. Keller's response was not a shout. He had learned that a level tone could carry more weight than a raised one. "She's safe here," he said. "If you need to make a claim, go through the system. We do not hand her over because you say so." Clive's face tightened. He moved closer, and for a sliver of time the clubhouse held its breath. Lucky, who had grown to like the bluntness of Norah's company, kept his hands visible, resting on a workbench. He did not brandish anything that could be mistaken for a weapon, but his presence was deliberate. He understood deterrence, how being steady, visible, and organized could keep someone from thinking he could take matters into his own hands. The biker's decision to involve CPS was, in the language of the town, a kind of moral claim. It said, "We will not let the private matter of a child's suffering remain private." But they were careful not to imagine CPS as a cure-all. They had stories of missteps and slow wheels. Keller himself had a cautious respect for the boundaries of their role. "We can hold a space and document," he said, "but the legal stuff has to be done by people who know the rules." Melina filed the initial reports with a practiced hand. She made phone calls that placed the clubhouse along a chain of responsibility. To police dispatchers who noted previous calls, to an intake supervisor who would flag the case, to a district attorney's office that sometimes handled temporary custody petitions when a child's safety was imminently in question. Her voice on the phone was the same linen of careful professionalism she had used in the clubhouse. "We have corroborated witness statements," she said, ticking off the notes as if they were boxes on a checklist. "We have physical evidence, photographs, dates, and a child's clear statement that she does not want to return to the foster home." The bureaucracy moved like a large animal. slow in its articulations, but capable of decisive, narrow actions when it perceived immediate danger. Melina did not promise a grand, sweeping rescue. She said what she could do now and what might follow. The men listened without surprise. They had not expected fireworks. They had expected, at best, the small justice of paperwork that might buy time. Norah's place in the clubhouse adjusted in ways that were almost domestic. Someone found an old blanket with a frayed edge and left it on the couch with a note pinned to it. 4N, sleep here if you need. The corkboard evolved to include a column for school nights and a list of things to pick up for dinner. Tina left a box of mismatched socks. Someone tossed in a pair that fit. A woman from the library stopped by and gave her a paperback with the corners worn from being read and reread. The men set up a small unofficial chore chart. Empty oil cans, sweep bench, check the air and tires. Norah's name rotated through it, a slow sign of being a member rather than a transient. Norah, for her part, began asserting small prerogatives. She marked a day on the calendar as library, the handwriting stiff but proud. She told Lucky she wanted to learn how to solder a wire properly. She started labeling not just her toolbox, but a small shelf where she kept a journal. Pages torn from a school notebook, a look at life that recorded the times the men kept their promises and the nights when worry sat heavy in the room like humidity. The bruise that had pulled Lucky's attention did not vanish.
New ones arrived in uneven patterns, on her forearm, the inside of her elbow, places someone would not notice unless they were looking. Lucky's ledgers thickened. He took another photograph, this one with more care, the kind of clinical shot a doctor might request. He saved the phone in a zippered pocket and kept a backup on a small flash drive he placed inside his toolbox. It was in the quiet of documenting that the clubhouse found its ethical center. They could have done nothing and pretended they had not seen. They could have shouted down Clive or tried to make him look foolish. Instead, they chose a steadier, more institutional route. Gather records, be witnesses, push the thread of evidence into the places that could make a legal difference. They did this not because they loved formality, but because they had learned that paperwork, signatures, and dates can outlast a man's temper. There were moments of friction. Clive called once at odd hours, a voice filtered through static that alternately pleaded and accused. "Bring her home," he would say. "That's your kid. She needs her family." When a man named Razor answered from the clubhouse, he did not invite escalation. He stated facts. Norah's attendance dates, who would vouch for her, that there had been a call to CPS. Clive's tone changed from pleading to hostile. "You people don't know what you're doing," he hissed at one point, as if dismissal could unmake the ledger entries and the dated photographs. Civility can crack into ugliness quickly when someone feels they are losing control. But the clubhouse held to the line they had drawn. No threats, no taking the law into their own hands. They made calls, they took notes. When Clive showed up at the diner and demanded to know who was feeding his foster child, Tina locked the diner for a minute and told him to leave. "She's safe," Tina said in the same matter-of-fact way she handed out sandwiches. "You're welcome to talk to Melina if you have concerns." There were nights when the men sat around the workbench and spoke of less romantic things. Their own failures, the times they had been wrong, the times they had been lucky. Moose Joe told a story about his brother, who had been good at making small, steady repairs until he couldn't do them at all. Lucky talked about the customers who came in with excuses for the bruises, stadium fights, clumsy falls, and how some people preferred the lie to the truth. These conversations were not performative. They were the subtler architecture of moral decision-making. A recognition that being on the right side of a child's suffering is not always heroic. Often it's small, an arranged ride, a meal, a signature. It is accumulated over bread and bolts and paperwork. Melina came again, with pads of paper and a printed form that smelled faintly of institutional offices. She wanted to confirm dates, to ask Norah if she felt safe, to hear the specifics in her own words.
Norah answered with the economy of someone who had learned to measure what she revealed. She named days and described nights as she needed to. She said, to Melina's question about fear, "Sometimes. Not here." The phrase was short, as a sentence can be, and as heavy. Melina explained options: an intake assessment, a possible temporary custody petition if the evidence supported the claim that returning home would be dangerous. "We can petition for temporary guardianship to be designated to a safe adult while investigations continue," she said, careful to avoid overpromising. "We try to keep legal decisions proportionate and in accordance with protocol." Keller, who had watched the quieter machinery of the law from a distance, watched Melina with that same observational habit. He understood that the system had rules, and that those rules were often slow. He also understood that time here mattered. He had seen children displaced and returned because of paperwork that moved too slowly. "If you need someone to be named as a safe adult," he said, thinking aloud, "Moose Joe would step up. He knows Norah. He'll sign the forms and be here." Moose Joe shifted in his seat at the mention of his name. He was a man who did things with his hands, and measured his worth by his capacity to be steady. He did not say much, but when he did, it carried the weight of a man who knew how to take on responsibility without fanfare. "I'll do what's right," he said. "I'll make sure she's safe. I won't make a show of it." The filings began to take shape: copies of photos, the ledger with dates, corroborating signatures. Melina made calls to the intake supervisor, who could prioritize an emergency petition if the evidence coalesced. She also called to arrange interviews with a school counselor, in case more corroboration came from attendance or behavioral notes. The legal machine did not roar into action. It creaked and took measured, necessary steps. Clive did not wait idly. He sent messages that were thinly veiled threats, and showed up outside the diner more often, hovering as if waiting for the men to slip. The police were called a few times, not to arrest anyone, but to make notes and to respond to complaints. The officers who came were polite and procedural. They wrote statements and logged times. No one expected an instant courtroom drama. What mattered was the accumulation. Not a single dramatic intervention, but a sustained net of paperwork and witnesses that could be used if the case required urgent measures. Through it all, Norah kept coming in to work. The routine calmed the jagged edges of fear. She learned to strip an old carburetor and to hold a soldering iron without wincing. She made friends in a clipped, utilitarian way, passing jokes with Lucky about the worst coffee the town could brew. She slept on the couch and woke early to sweep. She returned library books and read the margins in small, precise notes. The clubhouse had rituals. The way they set down tools, the way they wrapped a rag around a mug, the way someone always offered a sandwich. Those rituals became scaffolding. There were nights when she sat on the back stoop and watched the stars. The town was small enough that streetlights dulled constellations into suggestions, but she learned to find one that was steady. She put her toolbox beside her and ran a finger along the tape with her name. To outsiders, it might have looked like an ordinary object. To Norah, it was a thing that had been stamped with a vote. Someone, somewhere, had decided she mattered enough to have a tool that belonged to her. The decision to document and to involve CPS shifted not only Norah's immediate circumstances, but the way the town regarded the clubhouse. Neighbors who had once crossed the road to avoid eye contact began to bring in discarded winter coats. A teacher at the middle school asked if she could tutor Norah in algebra after classes. Tina left a small note. "If you need a night off from cooking homework, come by and eat." Still, the situation remained fragile. Documentation can create a pathway, but it does not guarantee safety. It does not stop a person who decides to escalate. It does not heal a child overnight. It only creates the factual trail that allows institutions to act within their mandates. The bikers understood this. They also understood that if they had not asked for help, Norah might have been left in a loop of silence and quick fixes. One crisp morning, the day after Melina had taken a set of photographs and filed preliminary reports, Clive drove onto the gravel lot outside the clubhouse and got out of his truck with a look that had the rehearsed composure of a man entering an unfamiliar room with an agenda. He walked toward the entrance with the kind of forward movement that refused to wait for an invitation. Inside, the men stopped. The jukebox hummed in the background. Norah stood by the bench, a wrench in her hand, and regarded him without the sheen of surprise. She had been told once, by an adult whose voice had been steady, that when confronted, she should keep her statements clear and count the witnesses. So she did. Clive said loudly enough for the room to hear, "You people can't keep my foster kid from me." His tone tried to draw on civic authority. The words were a claim, delivered as if entitlement equaled the right to decide another person's fate. Lucky set the wrench down so it made a soft clink on the metal top. "We didn't take her," he said. "She sleeps here sometimes. She works here. She's told us she doesn't want to go back. We've called the proper people. Let those people do their jobs." Clive's face tightened. The watch on his wrist reflected light like accusation. For a moment, the room hummed with a tension that might have been dangerous in another set of hands. But the bikers had rehearsed another response.
Moose Joe stepped forward and said calmly, "If you have concerns, you take them to Melina. We are witnesses. We signed things. We're not trying to steal anything. We're trying to keep a kid safe." Clive scoffed and walked toward Norah. His movement felt like an act of authority, a man accustomed to making decisions about someone else's life. Norah did not flinch. She did not step away. She kept her eyes on him like someone who had learned to anchor herself against storms. "She goes with me," Clive said, reaching out as if to assert control. Norah shook her head. It was not a dramatic refusal. It was an answer that carried the weight of experience. "No," she said, "I don't want to go back." That single word, "no," carried within it the years of small decisions it took to say it. It was not an evasion. It was an assertion. The room felt a brief, tight stillness, the kind that happens when a verdict is rendered in a small private court. Clive's jaw went hard. He made a noise like a man swallowing frustration and walked out. He did not act with violence. He did not escalate beyond the angry claim. But his leaving did not mean the situation had been resolved. It meant that the next stage, the legal stage, would be invoked. Melina called later that afternoon with a voice that held a little more urgency. "I've compiled the intake and we have corroborating signatures," she told Keller. "I can request an emergency hearing if the DA's office is willing to prioritize it. Their review will consider the child's statement and the physical evidence." She was careful again. No proclamation, only process. Keller's reply was brisk and practical. "Do it," he told her. There was a small ceremony that night, as if the clubhouse were marking a boundary. The men gathered around the corkboard. They pinned copies of the ledger and photographs in a neat row, like scrapings from a map. Someone slid an envelope into Norah's hand, a pair of sneakers that fit her without duct tape. She laced them up with an absent-minded gratitude that made them look like badges. Norah's mornings continued to have the same rhythm. She swept, tightened bolts, polished a metal casing until it gleamed like a small promise. In the quiet moments, she would open her journal and write a line or two. The lines were not long essays. They were remarks like, "Lunch with Tina," or "Melina came," and once, "I can solder." Each entry read like a small inventory of survivals. The accumulation of small acts, the ledger entries, photographs, signatures, meals, and a couch with a labeled blanket, was what made the case move from anecdote to action. It was not a dramatic storming of the courthouse.
It was a steady construction of evidence and responsibility, with the bikers acting as witnesses rather than judge and jury. On the night the paperwork left Melina's desk to go into the machine that might deliver a temporary guardianship petition, the clubhouse was quieter than usual.
The men drifted about in low conversation, touching the edges of ordinary life. Norah tightened the last screw on a small repair and set the tool in her named toolbox. She looked up at the ceiling where a single bulb hummed and thought of how a small question had shifted her life, not because it was dramatic, but because it opened a door to people who would choose to keep showing up. The move from an informal refuge to an institutional response was not inevitable, and it was not complete. The legal machinery had many layers, and human hearts have many fissures. But the question she had asked, "Can I work here?" had been a hinge. It had made visible the possibility that a child could ask for dignity and be given a place to earn it, and that a community could choose to translate that dignity into the sober tools of evidence and protection. Outside, the wind had settled. Inside, someone put on a pot of coffee and set another sandwich into a brown bag. Norah dusted her toolbox, running a finger along the masking tape that bore her name. She sat on the couch and opened her journal, pen poised. There were things to write down and things to leave unsaid. The night held both the ache of uncertainty and the small, stubborn possibility of being kept. That was where the story paused, not on the edge of triumph, not at the bottom of tragedy, but in the middle ground of choices, signatures, phone calls, a child's clear statement, and a community's decision to move from casual care to documented responsibility. The next steps would require more people, more signatures, a courtroom and its particularities, and decisions that could not be made by a single rusted wrench or a tucked-away ledger. For now, the clubhouse hummed with life, and Norah slept on a couch with a blanket and a name on a toolbox, the tangible proof that small acts of dignity can begin to change a town. Stay with this story. Watch what happens when a town chooses to act. The paperwork that Melina had tucked into a manila folder did its quiet work, like a machine whose only visible motion was the tick of a clock. It traveled through offices with stamped hands and notes in the margins. Intake, corroboration, review. Kella kept a copy folded into his wallet. Lucky slipped a disk with photographs into a secret pocket of his toolbox and checked it twice. The men talked less about what they feared and more about what they could do to make the days steadier. A spare set of keys for the clubhouse, a plan for school mornings, a list of people who could be called if Clive showed up again. They kept the ledger where it could be found, but not exposed, like a map saved under a floorboard. In the days that followed, tension gathered in small, ordinary ways. Clive slowed his visits. Sometimes he simply drove by slowly on Main Street to see who was sitting on the bench. Other times his messages were thinly veiled, the kind that tried to frighten by proximity rather than by words. Once he parked himself outside Tina's diner until a waitress refused to bring him coffee. He wanted to see if the men were meeting a stray child in secret. He wanted to show his control. Tina closed early and told him to leave. "Talk to Melina," she said, plain and unembellished. "We ain't keeping your kid from you. We're keeping her safe." Melina moved with the deliberate speed of someone balancing caution with urgency. She arranged interviews. A school counselor noted a pattern of absences and an edge to Norah's work. A neighbor confirmed they'd seen Norah in the clubhouse several evenings. The DA's intake team reviewed the materials and tentatively agreed there was enough to request a hearing that could, if the judge concurred, authorize short-term custody to a safe adult while investigations continued. It was not a sweeping victory. It was a tool to buy time and shelter. The date for the emergency hearing came up sooner than any of them expected. The courthouse smelled of old varnish and coffee, and the hallway held the low bureaucratic murmur of other people's crises being triaged.
Keller, Lucky, Moose Joe, and Melina sat together in a row, hands folded, their presence a vote in favor of a child's statement. Norah sat near the back, the hood of her sweatshirt tucked into her collar despite the summer warmth. She had chosen a plain shirt, the one that didn't invite questions. Her toolbox sat on her lap like something she had to hold to believe in it. Courtrooms have a way of making small things feel official. A court clerk called the case number in a voice that made the letters and digits echo. The DA introduced a stack of evidence: the ledger, photos, text logs, a list of witnesses with their signatures. Melina summarized her findings with the directness of someone who has learned that clarity matters in a language of forms. Keller and Lucky would be there as witnesses to attendance and to the pattern in the bruises. They would testify to dates and times and the observables that could not be dismissed as rumor. Clive arrived in a pressed shirt and an anger that was only partly disguised. He stood by his counsel and spoke in short, tidy sentences meant to reclaim control. "She's my foster child," his lawyer said, "and we have a plan for her care." There were forms on Clive's side, too, home visits, prior references that he placed on the table as evidence of being a responsible guardian. The courtroom listened like a town that had learned to weigh one set of papers against another. The heart of the hearing was not lawyers or legalese, but a child's voice. Melina explained that she wanted Norah to be asked directly if she wished to return to Clive's home. The presiding judge, a woman with careful eyebrows and a voice that could be kind and firm in equal measure, looked at Norah as if measuring how much to move the conversation onto the lightest possible ground and how much to let the child speak plainly.
When asked if she wanted to go back, Norah answered with the same straightforwardness she'd used at the clubhouse. "No, I don't want to go back." Her voice did not tremble, it simply stated itself like a fact. The judge asked a few calm follow-ups: whether she felt safe here, whether she had people she trusted, and Norah named the men in the room when she had to, sometimes with a pause that was less about uncertainty and more about letting the gravity of naming land softly. She spoke of work and of routines, of a toolbox with her name, of a couch and a blanket. She did not embellish. She did not cry on command. She answered, and the answers became documents in the judge's mind. Witnesses gave short testimonies that read like a ledger of ordinary things: dates Norah had worked, nights she had slept on the couch, the times bruises had been noticed and photographed. Lucky described the ledger and how he kept it. Keller explained how he had declined to hand Norah back to Clive and had instead insisted on following the legal pathway. Moose Joe described his own capacity to care: days he was available, whether he could take time off work, where he lived, and how the men would support a child's daily needs. Clive's counsel cross-examined with a narrow focus on procedure and the appearance of oversight. He asked whether the clubhouse was an appropriate place for a child to be spending nights. Keller answered plainly: "We keep her safe. We keep records. We make calls." Melina added the institutional voice: "This petition is for temporary guardianship while investigations proceed. It's a measure to ensure safety during review." The judge listened to the balance between the evidentiary facts and the parent's rights. She weighed the immediacy of potential harm against the need for due process. In the end, the decision was not a dramatic proclamation, but a measured order. The judge granted temporary guardianship to Moose Joe for the duration necessary to complete the investigations. The order was precise: temporary, limited, and subject to review. It named the scope: care, schooling decisions, medical consent where necessary, and required frequent check-ins with Melina's office. The judge emphasized that this was not an indictment or a declaration of guilt. It was a protective statute meant to minimize risk while facts were further examined. Moose Joe received the order with a kind of practical solemnity. He did not make triumphant gestures. He shook hands with Melina and signed the paperwork as required. His signature, bold and uncomplicated, was the legal equivalent of the steady, quiet acts he'd performed at the bench: turning bolts, pouring coffee,
offering a couch. For Norah, the order meant that she would not have to return to a home she said frightened her, at least for the immediate future. It meant that the men who had quietly built her calendar of small obligations could now act within a legal permission to keep her there. The aftermath of the hearing was not euphoric. There was relief, certainly, and an exhausted kind of gratitude that settled into the room like a warm cloth placed on a bruise. But the men knew the law's limitations. Temporary guardianship did not heal what had been done. It did not make a child's nights forgotten. It only shifted the logistics of who would sign forms and consent to appointments. Back at the clubhouse, the rituals adjusted. The corkboard gained another column, appointments. Melina's office and the school worked out times for Norah to meet with a counselor, someone trained to help a child articulate what she needed in ways that paperwork alone couldn't encapsulate. The counselor's office was small and smelled faintly of lavender and paper. The first session was not a breakthrough. It was an exchange of introductions and a learning that the room had rules. "We can talk about things that happened here," the counselor said, "or we can talk about other things. The choice is yours." Norah chose, at first, to talk about soldering and the naughty joy of making a joint hold. Moose Joe assumed daily responsibilities with the same unshowy competence he applied to any repair job. He woke early and made coffee. He took Norah to school when the day called for it. He met with Melina weekly. He did not posture or grandstand. He thanked the men at the clubhouse in that gruff, minimal way that meant more than many speeches. A beer left on the counter, his name scratched on a new key set. The men pooled a few small donations, a used bicycle for school commutes, some art supplies. And people across town who had watched the legal papers and weighed evidence in their minds began to offer small acts of support. An extra sandwich now and then, a tutoring hour after school. The town's perception of the clubhouse shifted in incremental gestures. Conversations at the barber shop changed from rumors to a cautious recognition that these men had taken on paperwork and witness statements with the same care they took to label a jar of bolts. A school teacher who had once crossed the street to avoid the clubhouse group dropped off an algebra workbook and offered to tutor. She said in private that seeing a child choose a place where she could be trusted to do work made her reassess the shorthand she had used for judging the whole place. There were logistical strains. Melina's office requested updated calendars and immediate notification if Clive attempted contact. The police logged several calls from the clubhouse when Clive appeared near the building. Each call produced a record, an additional line in a file that could be used for subsequent hearings. The bikers, committed to their rule not to be vigilantes, permitted the officers to handle formal complaints. They themselves remained visible and consistent. Someone on the stoop each night, someone at the door in the morning, someone to open the clubhouse when Norah needed a place to be before school. Weeks folded into months. Norah's bruises became less frequent. Whether that was because Clive had been told and thus chose to stay away, or because the presence of an active case had changed behavior, no one could claim with certainty. What could be seen plainly was the slow accrual of small, neutral acts that made living days gentler. A counselor who met twice a week and drew out from Norah the names of 2 things she liked each day. A teacher who marked attendance more gently and left sticky notes with encouragement on returned worksheets. Lucky, who, in a way that startled them both, taught Norah how to read a schematic for a wiring harness and praised her when she soldered a joint perfectly. The clubhouse itself softened around domestic edges. The blanket on the couch was washed regularly and replaced when it grew thin. Someone bought a lamp with a warm bulb and placed it on the end table. The corkboard expanded into a community board where people could post small offers, can tutor math, or offering ride to dentist. The toolbox with her name sat on a small shelf now when not in use, the tape worn at the edges where fingers had traced the letters. Norah used it for projects small and serious, fixing a lamp for the clubhouse, helping Razor disassemble a carburetor, cobbling together a birdhouse for a neighbor's child. The men did not pretend they had cured anything. They spoke candidly about the limits of what they could give. Keller, in particular, refused any grand narratives. "We kept our end of the world from getting lonelier," he would say, "that's all." But even that modest claim contained weight. The men who had once been judged as nuisances had become sustained, accountable elements in a child's life. They showed up for school meetings and signed forms. They attended service appointments when necessary. Their presence, once unnoticed, had become a cord of ordinary commitments that tied together a frayed map. There were hard moments, too. Clive's lawyer filed motions alleging procedural irregularities. A hearing requested new testimony. The legal work continued to ripple outward. Melina sometimes spoke of the case in a low voice. "We have to be thorough," she reminded the group. The men listened. They did not romanticize the system. They respected it as a structure that demanded clear records, and they were glad to be learning how to provide them. Norah's agency remained central. She attended meetings, sometimes in person and sometimes through a counselor, present at the clubhouse, so she did not have to be uprooted. When asked about school decisions or medical appointments, she was offered choices whenever possible. The team, Melina, Moose, Joe, the counselor, and the men from the clubhouse, made a point of including her preference in plans. It mattered, quietly but decisively, that a 13-year-old's small decisions were taken seriously. Slow healing did not erase the past. It reframed the future in small ways.
There were nights when Norah would wake and the old anxious script would unspool in her head. On such nights, someone would go to the couch, sit in the lamp's warm light, and talk quietly without pushing. It was the soft architecture of staying, an invitation rather than instruction. Those conversations were not always about trauma. Sometimes they were practical, like talking through homework or helping to choose which sneakers to wear. Choice and routine stitched things together. As autumn thinned into the brassy edges of early winter, the town marked a small ritual, a community dinner at Tina's Diner, where neighbors dropped in with pies and casserole dishes. It was never billed as a fundraiser or a rallying cry, just an evening where people could come and sit. The diner filled with conversations about nothing and about everything: the weather, how the mayor had trimmed the park, a child's teeth. Norah sat at a corner table with Moose Joe and Lucky. She ate a piece of apple pie without asking for permission and offered a fork to Barker across the booth. The evening was ordinary, and its ordinariness felt like a triumph. Months passed with the steady, unflashy logic of habit. The legal case moved forward according to its own pace, with hearings that considered new evidence and evaluated progress. The temporary guardianship remained in place while the investigators completed their work. No grand verdict crowned the story. There were only the small markers of an adult system working as it was designed to, methodically, sometimes slowly, but capable of making decisions that protected a child for the days when her need was most acute. The subtle, cumulative acts of care had effects that reached beyond Norah. A younger boy in the neighborhood, curious about a half-finished radio outside the clubhouse, began to stop by after school. He watched Norah thread wire and listened to her talk about how heat made the solder flow, how careful pressure and patience could coax metal into holding. Norah, who had been taught by hardened hands, found herself the teacher. She showed him how to steady a wire with one hand and guide the iron with the other. The small boy's eyes lit up at making a circuit glow. Norah's face softened in a way that looked like relief. There was a quiet shift in perception. People began to see the clubhouse for the net it had become rather than for the rough fabric it had once seemed to be. The men refused to become sanctified figures. They remained unapologetically imperfect. They argued about trivial things, music that should be played or not, and they admitted mistakes when they made them. That humility was part of their credibility. They had not sought to be knights. They had simply chosen a line of care and kept walking it. The case's formal elements eventually wound toward their appropriate ends: hearings, reports, and reviews. The investigators completed interviews.
The DA's office considered charges and the weight of evidence. The record produced by the bikers and Melina's careful notes proved crucial in ensuring the child's protection. But the specifics of any criminal resolution remained in the hands of prosecutors and courts. Outcomes the clubhouse did not control and could not claim as victories of their own making. The men remained grateful for the legal system's capacity to act on the facts they had gathered. They also kept their focus on what they could give daily: presence and work. By the time winter rounded the town into a different light, Norah had a rhythm that held. She attended school more regularly. She answered questions in class with a new ease. Her grades were not miraculous, but they improved in steady increments. She continued to sleep at the clubhouse when needed, and when she did, the couch had fresh sheets and a small lamp beside it. The toolbox with her name was not an empty symbol anymore. It held projects she had finished for the place and for neighbors. It was a portable ledger of competence. The final image that closed the arc of months was modest and exact. On a gray afternoon, with snow like sifted dust in the air, Norah leaned over a tiny workbench in the back of the clubhouse and taught a younger child to thread a wire through a small terminal. Her hands were careful in the way a person who had learned how to be careful becomes: patient, methodical, unshowy. The boy asked a question about the heat of the soldering iron, and she smiled and explained, fingers steady. Moose Joe looked on from a stool, the legal papers filed and placed in a drawer, the temporary guardianship having done its work of creating space for a child to decide what she wanted. Later that night, Norah sat for a while outside on the stoop, looking up. The stars were faint, the town lights making constellations into suggestions, but she found one that seemed steady. She kept her toolbox beside her and ran a finger along the worn tape that still bore her name. There was a kind of quiet satisfaction in the small, plain object, proof that someone had decided she was worth a tool and the dignity of effort. The clubhouse hummed behind her. The sound of someone turning a wrench, the rattle of a radio tuned low, the clink of a mug set down. It was not resolution in grand terms. It was a succession of small acts that kept coming. If this story has stayed with you, there are ways to turn feeling into action. Look up local child welfare organizations and volunteer programs in your area. Donate to shelters and community centers that provide safe spaces for youth. And report any concerns to local authorities when you suspect a child may be in danger. Links and resources are in the description below. The real twist in the town's story was never a sudden deus ex machina. It was an ethical pivot.
A 13-year-old asked for work instead of pity, and people answered not by replacing the law with their own hands, but by combining steady care with the formal tools that can protect a child. It was proof that when a community chooses responsibility over indifference, small things, ledgers, signatures, sandwiches, a named toolbox, add up into protection and, eventually, into a life that has room to grow. Norah closed the toolbox and lugged it inside. She placed it on the shelf where younger hands could reach it in time. She did not imagine herself healed or the system perfected. She imagined evenings where she could rest without fear, and days where she could teach someone else to steady a wire. That, in the end, felt like enough. A child's plain request met with a town that had decided to keep showing up.